Hi everyone, and welcome to the flipped collab for assessment 1B, the folio. As you can see, it's sort of like a continuation of the first folio that was for A1A, except that this time we are sort of getting a little bit more specific and honing in our skills a little bit, because we're not looking at an overall unit plan, but this time we're looking specifically at a lesson plan for literacy. So some elements are very similar to the first folio, particularly the rubric, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. So if you did decide to choose a folio for A1A, you might like to continue with the folio and perhaps you even use some of the ideas that you used in your original unit plan. You might want to use some of the same literacy outcomes and ideas that you had in your unit plan, but this time hone it in and get a really detailed lesson plan. Now, it does need to be your own work, but it doesn't mean that you can't be inspired by others, I suppose. So you might have a lesson plan that you've used on a prac, you might have a lesson plan that you developed with a teacher, you might have a lesson plan that a teacher gave you. These can all be used for inspiration and for ideas, but you do need to submit your own original piece for this particular assessment. But it's always a great idea to look afield and see what you can find to give you some ideas. So as you can see, our word limit is 1,500 words. Now, I've been thinking sort of all afternoon about how that's going to sort of break down over the unit plan, and I don't have any specific numbers for you today, but that will be something that we could discuss further perhaps in the interactive collab when it comes up in a few weeks, so very, very quick. This particular folio is weighted at 30% and it is due on the 14th of January, which is week 9, and I know it seems like an awfully long time away, but we want to give you lots of information before the Christmas break and consolidation week, so that you've got plenty of time, if you wish to work on it in that time, that you've got the information available to you. I haven't made specific slides this time for this flipped collab because I wanted to sort of jump between a few different websites and things to show you. So I haven't got slides as such. And you'll see why in a minute, I suppose, because I wanted to start with jumping into the template. So as you scroll down the assessment details, you'll find that, of course, you've got two options again. So the other one is the other A1B, which is planning for diverse learners, which I'm also going to make a flip collab about, and this folio. So if we click into assessment details, it tells us that we have the 1,500 words to play around for this lesson plan. We need to make sure that it is upper years of primary, so it's specifically between the years 3 and 6. And I know a lot of people were wondering why that was, and that's basically because when you did developing literacy prior to this unit, it had a heavy focus on early years and sort of early years of primary. So this time we're giving you lots of chances to be exposed to middle and upper school, because that's what you'll be needing to teach when you get yourself a job. If you click on lesson plan template, which I'm not going to click on because it pops us up here, you'll see that we've got this lesson plan, that this is what we need to fill in. So if I scroll down, you'll see that it's all very well set up for us, and it gives us some little clues underneath about what needs to be included in each section. So it's kind of very straightforward. So all we need to do is submit this particular Word doc filled in. Makes it much easier. There's no second guessing about the format. There's no wondering specifically what things need to be included. It's just set out for us here. So I'm just going to pretty much talk you through this lesson plan, give you some of my ideas, relate it to a lesson plan that's already within the Swinburne portal, and also make some connections to curriculum. So the lesson plan starts off with the title and the duration of the lesson. But before you even get to that, you're going to have to start thinking about exactly what your lesson is going to be about. It's quite open in the fact that you can choose something, I suppose, that's reading related or writing related, or even perhaps something speaking and listening related. You can choose whichever one takes your fancy there. Once you've decided on which sort of elements you're looking at, you need to have a think about what it is that you're going to be teaching and try and hone it in and be as explicit as possible, which is where some of these top sort of rationale and lesson objectives come in. Okay, so if we start off at the beginning of our lesson plan template, you'll see that it has the lesson objective at the front, and then just skipping down to this sort of middle element here, we also have the rationale. So I can understand why it could be sometimes tricky to understand what the difference is between the lesson objective and what the rationale is. But when I think of lesson objective, I think very specifically of things like a learning intention and the success criteria. So if you had to think about what the learning intention is of the particular lesson, whether it's to take simple sentences and to make them into complex sentences using conjunctions, or is it to be able to use evidence from the text to look for clues? Is it to be able to understand the elements of a narrative? So students should be able to understand what the learning intention is and what they need to do to achieve it. So this part could just be dot points about what your lesson objective is. And if you get a little bit stuck, use a curriculum to help you, because the curriculum is quite specific and it can tell you and even help you write what your lesson objective is. So if I scroll to my other tab here, you can see that this is the Australian curriculum and this is the scope and sequence. So you can see where it builds on from the skills. So if you understand, and we'll scroll down a little bit, so say at grade 4 level that kids need to understand the difference in the language between opinion and feeling when they're doing their factual reporting, that could be the objective of your lesson, that kids are going to understand the difference between opinion and feeling, or whether they're going to be able to, let's scroll down a little bit more, they're going to be able to use quotation marks. They're going to be able to identify the features of online text. So if you use the curriculum as a guide, that will help you with your learning objective and being able to write what your learning intention is. The rationale is more of sort of an overview. So if we have a look at our Swinburne lesson plan and we have a look at the rationale here, it talks about the fact that the plan of the lesson is that students are already able to write a basic recount. They're going to write a recount about the sports day, but to make it more engaging and incorporating some elements of multiliteracies, they're going to use photo story as a means to support the recounts. So that's what the rationale is. It's just an overview in a few sentences, doesn't have to take up a lot of your word count, but it's just an overview of what the lesson essentially is going to be about. You don't need to talk about why you're doing it, but it does say, for example, here the aim of the lesson is to move beyond a written recount and to move into something more engaging and using multimodal elements. So it just talks about what the aim of the lesson is and what you're trying to achieve. This part here is very well connected in our Swinburne example as well, because on this side of our table, it talks about the fact that there's curriculum links and curriculum links to other curriculum areas. So we all know that with our literacy planning that often we incorporate elements of whatever our inquiry learning is for that term into our literacy to give us some sort of basis. And we often cover a lot of those inquiry elements through our literacy as well. So if you were learning about the first fleet, or if you were learning about inclusion and diversity for people with special needs and disabilities, or if you were learning about sustainability and design, or if you're learning about science, there could be some other curriculum areas that are being covered within your lesson. So if you're going to use a particular text, if you're going to use a particular, you might have a text that's all about planets, so you can maybe relate it to some science units. As we said before, if you've got a text, it might be about some element of history or looking at historical figures, so you're going to be covering those curriculum links as well. They're sort of more the general capabilities, but you also might have things like cross-curriculum priorities, which you'll be used to from Assessment 1A, where it talks about things like perhaps Indigenous connections, or if it has creative and critical thinking connections. So have a look at those sort of cross-curriculum priorities as well. You might be wondering how to set this side out, because it talks about content, descriptors and codes, and then the strands. But if you have a look at the Swinburne example, it sets it out quite nicely for us here. So it shows us on this side how we can set out the substrands. So we just have to say that we've got language and we've got literature and we've got literacy, and you mention what the substrands are. So for example, in this lesson, you've got text structure and organization, you've got expressing and developing ideas. And on this side, we've got the codes. Can I please suggest that you don't just list the codes as they have done there, because it is impossible for your ELA to click on every single code during marking time. So can you please list what the actual descriptors are, because your ELA will want to see that your curriculum links are appropriate to what your learning intention is. So if you're telling me that your learning intention is to get easy sentences and to make them into complex sentences using conjunctions, then you need to find an AC link that supports that. If you're going to be using different comprehension methods, then your AC link is going to be something to do with comprehension. So you also need to be very, very explicit. If you have trouble finding AC links and you're not quite sure, you know, well, I'm doing elements of a narrative, I'm not quite sure if this one is appropriate, talks about writing, but I'm not quite sure, ask your ELA to check it for you. So this is how we need to set out our substrands and our content descriptors. So we've got the content descriptors up the top, and then we've got the substrands down below. So we've got our lesson objective covered, we've got our curriculum links covered, we've got our rationale of the lesson covered. So let's have a look at student prior knowledge. So if we assume that our lesson is based at grade 3, then we should know that the students are coming to you with already a knowledge base. Again, if it's grade 4, grade 5 or grade 6, they're coming to you knowing certain things. So you need to know what your starting point is. You need to know what students already know, what have they done before, and this is where this scope and sequence is actually quite fantastic, because it shows you the progression of skills. So if you're talking about punctuation and your lesson is based around punctuation, you can see through the AC here how it's developed and gotten more complex and more involved as it's gone from foundation to grade 6. So use this. If you are going to make a lesson at grade 3, where we're going to have word contractions as a feature of informal language and apostrophes, I'm not going to read the whole lot out, but if you're going to have a lesson where that is your focus, then you can assume that this knowledge has already been embedded within those students. So you can assume that, you know, they're going to recognize capital letters, probably don't need to go that far back. Let's have a look at grade 2. We can recognize that capital letters signal proper nouns, and commas are used to separate items in lists. So it's building on the knowledge each and every time. Even for more complex skills, let's scroll down to something like, no, I'm going to keep scrolling. Actually, I'm going to scroll all the way back up because I want to, we've only got language here, but just remember there'll be other ones as well. So even things like social interactions and how they influence people. So you can see here how it's developed throughout the different year levels as well. In the early years, it talks more about understanding relationships between people and then understanding facial gestures, moves on to talk about social classroom elements, moves on to talking about things in, say, grade 4 and grade 5 about social interactions and understanding, you know, having the sense to be able to sort of summarize your own point of view, reporting to larger groups, and it's really building on that element of discussion. So look at what your students will already know. Look at the curriculum, use it, give you some ideas on what the starting point would be. You need to make sure that the lesson is pitched to the correct level. So if you're telling me it's a grade 6 lesson and that they're going to be working on capital letters, well, we know that that's not appropriate. So use the curriculum and really get to know what it is that the lesson is about, but also what the kids' starting point is, because we all need to show that we've got some sort of data or skills base that we can build off. So on this side, we've got, I think in our lesson plan, hold on, if I just think, we've got a little bit about students' prior knowledge in there if you wanted to have a look. They've kept it quite brief. Your one might be a little bit more involved because there might be a little bit more to your lesson about what students need to know, but it might just be a couple of sentences. Okay, so we're going to teaching strategies now. Now, teaching strategies you should be fairly used to already because we talked about it in both of the A1As. And we're talking about that idea of pedagogical practice again, and we're talking about the idea of how the lesson is going to be taught. So again, we're going to be focusing on all of the same things that we looked at with A1A. So think about things that are like specific to literacy. So is there going to be elements of the gradual release of responsibility? Will there be a shared element? Will there be something that's guided, or is the teacher going to be modelling something? Is there going to be an element of reflection at the end? Is there going to be any visual thinking strategies used? Are the kids going to be collaborating? Are there going to be multi-literacies used? And I would say yes at some point. So think about all the teaching strategies that can be used within your lesson and just give us a list. So at the moment, we're just listing them. We don't have to elaborate on them too much further because when you get further down into the lesson plan, you're going to be talking about how you're going to use them. Just remember that we are always keeping the idea of diverse learners in the back of our minds. So when we're thinking about the teaching strategies and the pedagogical practice that we're going to use, we do need to realise that although it is, say, you might pitch it as a grade 4 lesson, we're always going to assume that there's a diverse need within every classroom, as there always is, and that differentiation needs to occur. So when you're thinking about the practices that you're going to use, we always need to have those sort of elements underpinned, because we have to show how we're going to cater and differentiate the lesson to a wide range of learners and a wide range of capabilities. We'll talk more about diverse learning as we push on further, but it is something to bear in mind when you're thinking about teaching strategies. It also is something to bear in mind when you're thinking about assessment strategies, because we need to make sure, probably ideally, two things with the assessment strategies. So we're thinking about, you know, is our assessment inclusive of everybody? Is it catering to all of the different needs in the classroom? So we're talking about kids who are very high, kids who are struggling, kids who perhaps have cultural differences. So all of the sorts of things that we have in a classroom, can we make sure that our assessment strategies are catering to the needs of the students in the grade? But also we need to make sure that our assessment strategies are appropriate to whatever the learning intention and the success criteria is. So if we're going to say that, you know, the focus of our lesson was a speaking and listening focus, and we're going to get the kids to do an oral presentation about a particular subject, well, we wouldn't want an assessment strategy that assess their writing or their reading. We need to make sure that our assessment strategy fits in with the purpose of the lesson. So we should be able to see that when we're marking your lesson plan, that your assessment strategy is appropriate. If it's a reading lesson, it should be some sort of reading assessment. Obviously, writing is going to call for a writing assessment. It doesn't have to be something particularly sort of like a diagnostic test or anything like that. But, you know, if your lesson focus was that you wanted the kids to develop more complex sentences, well, maybe it is that you get them to write you 5 sentences and you explain that sort of assessment that you're going to have a look at. You know, if it was something to do with being able to develop questions, maybe you get them to write down 5 questions. So it can just be something that's very simple. Doesn't need to be something overly complex, but it does need to cater to the range of students in your grade, and it does need to match with the learning intention so that you are assessing the skills You want to be able to see how your lesson went. You want to know that kids now have new information that they have taken on from the lesson. You want to know how well your lesson went. You need assessment strategies that are going to fit in with that. I'm not sure if there's any assessment strategies in this one. No, oh yes, there is. So in this one we've got, going back to our idea of getting the students to use Photo Story. For the recount, they've decided to have a checklist because they're going to record participation. Not sure whether that's giving us much idea on how the students went in being able to develop their recounts though. A rubric to assess, there must be rubrics further down. We're going to use peer assessment, which is a great idea because then we get kids talking and doing a bit of self-reflection, which I think is good. So if we scroll right down, no, it doesn't appear here. So if you perhaps have a look yourself, I was hoping they'd be right underneath, but they're not. If you have a look yourself at these appendix, then you might be able to see what kind of rubrics and things that they attached. So ideally with their assessment, it should be something that shows that they're able to use multimodal elements within their recount. So let's go back to our template. We've got the learning environment on this side. So it's basically to do with things with classroom setup. So is there things that the teacher would need to set up in the classroom, or how is the lesson going to run? Is it going to be that perhaps certain tables need to be set up you know, in groups, or do we need to move tables out the way because it's all going to be done on the floor? Do we need to go outside? You know, what's happening within the learning environment and within the classroom that needs to be set up for your particular lesson. There might not be much to it because it might just be back at tables as per usual, but it's just something to bear in mind about how your learning environment is going to look, and does it need to be prepared. So in this example, it sort of pulls the learning environment and the resources back into one, which our one separates into two, but it's basically saying that we just need the classroom and the technology lab. So that might be all your one says as well. Doesn't need to be much in that particular box. Now we've got resources here, and it does say and activities, but I am essentially going to keep it pretty much as resources because I think the activities will be further explained in your actual lesson itself. You might link it to some activities, so you might talk about the fact that, you know, you might need paper, you might need pens, you might need the whiteboard. Talk about all of the resources you would use. So pretend that you're actually going to go into the classroom and teach this lesson, and give yourself an idea of what things are going to need to be ready and resources that you're going to need to set up this particular lesson. It might link to a particular activity, so just bear that in mind as well. So this is where we get in sort of the nitty-gritty of the actual lesson itself. So it starts at stage 1, as you can see here, and goes through to stage 3. So it's basically just outlined into 3 sections. That it's assuming that there's going to be some sort of mini lesson or some sort of shared idea at the beginning, or some sort of introduction, they're calling it, to engage students at the start. So what is going to be happening at the beginning of the lesson to tune the students in? Is there going to be discussion about prior knowledge? Is it going to be getting their minds ready to think about a certain thing? Is there going to be something at the whiz bang at the beginning of the lesson to capture their imaginations and engage them? So what's going to happen at the beginning of your lesson that's going to be setting the lesson up? It's probably a good idea where learning intentions and success criteria come out, because the students need to know exactly what the focus is for the lesson. So you want to make it fairly engaging and fairly interesting and very explicit as to what the learning intention is. So let's have a look at the Swinburne example and see what they have. There's this broken down into the 2 elements on side by side, which we don't need. But basically when I scroll through, I can see that there's a bit of, there's a bit of a reflection on what the sports day was like. They're going to be doing a think, pair, share to get their mind ready. And there's going to be lots of prompting and modelling by the teacher in terms of how they want the recount with the photo story to be used. I imagine this being a lot of teacher modelling, because you want the students to have that correct expectation on what they then need to go back and do independently. Sorry about that, I keep clicking on the parts of that. It is, oh, that lesson plan is, as you can just hear, when you click on different sections, there is somebody who talks to you and talks you through it, so that might be helpful as well if you have a listen to that. So what the body of the lesson, so you're going to describe each activity and the order in which it's undertaken and provide an estimate on how long each activity should take. So I'm not assuming that that's going to be too difficult. You might have done it before if you've done prac, where you just talk through each part of the activity and what students are going to be doing and roughly how long it's going to take. So we have a look at this one. It's got things like, the students are going to get this 5 to 6 images. They're going to put them in a graphic organizer. They're going to work in groups to do the recount, just talking through bit by bit on what the students are going to be doing. So the conclusion is going to be how you draw the lesson ideas together so that the students can evaluate what they have learned, how you prepare the students for the next lesson. So this is where I'm seeing some sort of coming back together and sort of reconnecting and perhaps reflecting, or perhaps having some sort of discussion. However you see fit to end your lesson that gets the kids reflecting on what they've learned, perhaps having a discussion, thinking about what the next step could be for next time. That's going to be your conclusion of your lesson. So here we're talking about differentiated learning, which is where I said that I'd come back to that idea towards the end. So we're thinking about how we can use differentiated learning and explain how it will take place. So we need to make considerations for diverse learners and inclusive methods, exactly the same way that we would have done in assessment 1A. So if you have a look at week 6, it talks in detail about diverse learning and catering to the needs of different students, and I particularly liked the video where the professor talked about different elements of differentiation, and she talked about things like, if you want to be inclusive of students with diverse needs, which is every classroom, we need to think about, having things like multiple pathways, so students can choose ways from getting from A to B. So when you have a think about when you're designing your lesson, are there different ways of getting to the one destination? Is there an element of choice that students have, or how are you going to cater? How are you going to provide different avenues for 26 students to all get from A to B? So she talked a lot about multiple pathways, which I thought was interesting. She also talked about teaching approaches, which links into your pedagogical practices, which we talked about earlier. So you think about how your pedagogical practices are catering to diverse needs. So if you're going to be using a lot of visual thinking strategies like Think, Pair, Share, or like the KWL charts that we used in A1A, how that can perhaps cater to diverse needs. Are you going to have an element where kids are going to be sketching instead of writing, because that that's going to connect with some students who maybe aren't proficient at writing, so you give them a chance to get their ideas down by drawing. These are all things that are going to help show elements of differentiation within your lesson. Do you think about grouping? Do you think about how students could be set together to help with certain elements of differentiation in the lesson? Are there different tasks that could be done differently in a differentiated fashion? Do you have different routines and procedures that help to engage a diverse range of students? And we're not talking about like extreme needs. We're talking about the fact that every lesson needs to be differentiated in every classroom, because there's always a diverse need in every classroom. So your last part is your lesson plan evaluation, and it reminded me a lot of one more thing I want to say about differentiation, I've just looked at my notes, was The other thing that you could talk about as well is feedback, and the fact that there could be a point within your lesson where students feed back to you, or perhaps you feed back to them and give them specific feedback that moves their learning forward. You could vary the speed and delivery of your lesson. You could modify tasks. You can even perhaps use some sort of data initially to inform your teaching. So you could link that into your lesson too. Sorry, just some things that I missed. Please excuse the fact that it says unit here. I think that should have said lesson. So describe how this lesson can support children's literacy development. This is very, very similar to the end of the unit plan if you did A1A, the folio. So you would be used to what this means. So you're talking about the fact that this particular lesson is going to be able to support literacy development. So let's go back to my example of being able to build on basic sentences and make them into complex sentences. Well, that's going to help to develop students' literacy development by helping them to engage with their writing and being able to help to make their writing more detailed, therefore being able to be more fluent with their writing. If you were going to have a lesson perhaps about using analysing bias, so a lot of the grade 6 outcomes talk about being able to identify sort of a bias and an influence within writing and understand the author's intent when something is written. So being able to do that is going to further your literacy development because you're able to understand that things are not written neutrally, and that they could apply that to reading throughout their life. If you're going to have a lesson about inferring, you could make connections back to the fact that it's important to be able to sort of analyse and read between lines and use text, sort of clues specific to text to be able to build your idea of comprehension. So that's going to take up 200 words, which is the only part of the lesson that is specific in sense of a word count. So we've got 200 used in that last part, and the rest of it's pretty much spread out through the rest of the lesson plan. As I said before, I haven't got specifics about how I would break it up yet. We'll save that for the interactive collab, which is coming up in week 6. As I said last time, these are all brand new assessments, and there might be something that I might go, oh, I forgot to mention that. So please come to the interactive collab, or at least listen to the interactive collab, because there might be new information or things we haven't thought of, or our ELAs are absolutely wonderful, so they might be able to put a different spin on things or something that I didn't think of. So please keep engaged with all of the DB posts and the other things that come out, because there might be more information that could potentially help you as well. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the unit.